Hello and welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name is Carl and it's good to have you with us. This week we're considering a healing story in which Jesus attracted controversy through acting on the Sabbath. Before we dive into any of that, however, if you've not done so already, you might find it helpful to download the sheet that accompanies this study, and you can find the link for that in the video description in YouTube. On the sheet you will find the text of today's reading, some other passages you may wish to look up, the questions we'll be considering together later on, and lots of room for you to record your own thoughts and observations. And so without further ado then, let's dive into today's passage, which comes from Luke's Gospel, chapter 13, verses 10 to 17. We're continuing our journey through the travel narrative of Luke's Gospel. In chapter 9, verse 51, Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem, and he will arrive there by chapter 19, verse 27. In that portion of Luke's Gospel, this travel narrative, we encounter a lot of Jesus' teaching, his parables, his miracles, and his sayings. He just dealt with some questions from people in the crowds that were following him around as he made his way from Galilee to Jerusalem, about whether a direct link can be drawn between sinful behaviour and terrible suffering. Jesus uses the parable of the unfruitful fig tree to argue that while there is no direct correlation as such necessarily, we nonetheless need to take seriously the call to bear fruit as children of God. That's chapter 13, verses 1 to 9. And now the action in this reading shifts from an outdoor context to an indoor one. Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath day, and we find various other occasions in Luke's Gospel where he had done something similar, for example in chapter 4 verses 16 through to 30. On that occasion things hadn't gone so well at all, in that while the crowd reacted very positively to Jesus' initial reading from the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, things rapidly turned negative to the point where they sought to kill him. And yet, Jesus had persisted in things like healing on the Sabbath, as we see in chapter 6, verses 6 to 11, where he healed a man with a withered hand in the synagogue on the Sabbath day. And perhaps reflecting the wider context of Luke's Gospel and Luke's community, about which I'll say a bit more in a moment, in chapter 12, verse 11, Jesus warned about facing trials in the synagogues. So in this passage, this healing and controversy narrative, we have Jesus on the road to Jerusalem and addressing various conflicts and disagreements with other authorities within the lively and varied Judaism of his day. We have an unnamed woman who we're told had been disabled by some sort of back problem that had left her unable to straighten up properly and had been afflicted by that for 18 long years. In this account, she's set free, she's healed by Jesus. We have a synagogue leader who it seems objects to Jesus' healing on the Sabbath day, and he tries to turn the crowd against Jesus. And this crowd, I suspect, included at least some of the people who'd been following Jesus on the road, as well as those who were regulars in that particular synagogue environment. Now, Luke's Gospel was the third of the four canonical Gospels to be written, around 80 to 85 of the Common Era. And by that point, there was a real divergence emerging between churches and synagogues following the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in the year 70. And there was a certain amount of rubbing against each other and hostility that was going on. And I think perhaps that explains some of Jesus's attitude to synagogue leaders who take a stance against what he was trying to do in proclaiming the kingdom of God in word and deed. So there's that undercurrent at work in today's passage. Now, in verse 10, when we are told that Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues, as is often the case in Luke's Gospel, we're not told the specific location of this synagogue. And there was an unnamed woman we are told about in verse 11 who was suffering from a disability that, as I say, had left her unable to stand up straight and which had persisted for 18 years. Well, we have this numerical clue. We also note that, like the place where this action happened, she too was unnamed. And her being unnamed enables her to stand on one level for a number of people who may be weighed down or disabled in some way, as Jesus goes on to say, by Satan, in other words, by forces that are not their fault and beyond their control. Now, some commentators have suggested that this woman's disability would have rendered her kind of persona non grata in the life of the synagogue and led to her being marginalised. But actually, there's no evidence in this narrative that that's actually the case. The woman was, it seems, freely present in the synagogue. She wasn't kept tucked away behind some sort of screen or up on another level out of the way. So there's nothing to suggest that she'd been excluded. It seems that she was as welcome in her synagogue as the man with the withered hand in chapter 6, verses 6 to 11 had been in his. So we do need to challenge that narrative about synagogue and exclusion as we come to this story. Now, we don't know if the woman in this narrative actively set out to approach Jesus or not, but we do know that he saw her, and it's significant here that he addresses her as woman, as gyne in the Greek. It's the only place in Luke's Gospel where Jesus addresses anyone using that kind of term. Yes, it's a term that's very common in the last of the four canonical Gospels to be written, in John's Gospel. So we might think of, for example, John chapter 2 verse 4 as Jesus refers to his mother Mary as woman. We might think of chapter 4 verse 21 and his interaction with the Samaritan woman at the well. We might think of chapter 8 verse 10 and the woman caught in adultery. And latterly in chapter 20 verse 15 we might think of Mary Magdalene, the first woman to witness the resurrection, indeed the first person to witness the resurrection of Jesus in the garden. So I suspect the use of this term woman is intended not to be offensive in any way, just as I don't think it was offensive in John's Gospel. But it's not perhaps as significant for Luke as it is for John as a term of address. Now, unlike the woman who had been suffering from hemorrhaging for a number of years, whose story we hear about in chapter 8 verses 43 to 48, in this story, it's Jesus who takes the initiative rather than the woman as such. He calls her over, he pronounces her to be free from her ailment, as we hear in verse 12. And at the beginning of verse 13, we hear that he lays hands on her, and that's what sets her free. Her response, as we hear about in the latter part of verse 13, is one of praise. In the Greek, doxaso, same root as doxology, which means a hymn of praise. But her praise, which would later be resonated with by the crowd gathered in the synagogue, was not a mindset that was shared by the synagogue leader. And in verse 14, he complains about Jesus' healing on the Sabbath and basically says there are 6 other days of the week to heal. Why are you doing it today? And it seems he tried to turn the crowd against Jesus. Now, the response of the crowd shows that this wasn't the synagogue as a whole rejecting Jesus. And we need to be very careful that in our interpretation of passages like this, that we recognise that it was about particular individuals, and in this case someone who happened to be in a leadership role, rather than making sweeping statements about the Judaism of Jesus' day as if he was somehow detached from it, or as if indeed all Jewish people were somehow legalistic and uncaring. That's not what's going on here. And indeed you could argue that that synagogue leader has something of a point, as Exodus chapter 31 verse 34 makes it clear that work was not permitted on the Sabbath. And yet Jesus' counter-argument to this synagogue leader begins by thinking about from what work was allowed, in common with many of a Jewish argument about what should and shouldn't take place on the Sabbath. So when Jesus addresses this synagogue ruler using the group term, "you hypocrites," at the beginning of verse 15, Luke implies that through this, that this wasn't the first time or the only time that Jesus had encountered such cynicism from people in authority, and I think was used to getting involved in these sorts of debates with other Jewish leaders about things like the interpretation of the Sabbath. Now, Jesus uses a standard form of rabbinical argument to make his point. He does an argument that proceeds from something lesser through to something greater. If folk are okay to lead their animals to water on the Sabbath, Jesus says, then surely someone whose situation is far more deserving of attention than that, someone who's been held captive by Satan for 18 long years, should be able to be set free on that Sabbath day. Indeed, I think the argument in verses 15 and 16 could be summed up very neatly as, well, what better day is there to set somebody free than on the Sabbath day? And it invites us to step back a bit and think about what the point of talking about Sabbath was. In Exodus, Sabbath is linked with creation and God's resting on the seventh day. But in Deuteronomy, interestingly, Sabbath is linked with God's liberation of the people from oppression in Egypt. Time and time again, they're told, once you were slaves in Egypt, so treat others well. You know what it's like to be oppressed and marginalised. And I think it's that sense of freedom from oppression, which chimes back to chapter 4, verses 18 and 19, where Jesus sets out his manifesto involving liberation of the oppressed. I think all of that is underplaying here, his actions and his argument. The attribution of the blame for what's going on with this woman to Satan rather than to her chimes in with what Jesus has been talking about earlier in chapter 13, as I said in verses 1 to 9, about trying to break a causal link between sin and suffering that some had in their minds, and indeed people still posit today. And in calling this woman a daughter of Abraham in verse 16, he's using a term that, as I say, is often used when liberation is enabled. So for other examples, you might think of Mary in the Magnificat in chapter 1 verse 55. Or we might think of Zechariah in the Benedictus in chapter 1 verse 74, for just a couple of examples of that focus on people being set free. And Abraham also appears in other texts where the focus is on eschatological salvation. It's on the being set free when the kingdom of God comes in all of its fullness. And we might look, for example, at chapter 13 verse 28, chapter 16 verses 22 to 30, and chapter 20 verse 37 as just a few examples of that kind of dynamic. The phrase daughter of Abraham, or child of Abraham you could say, chimes with another instance as well, where Jesus uses that kind of language. In chapter 19, verse 9, he refers to the tax collector, Zacchaeus, as a son of Abraham. So there's a sense of being liberated when Jesus uses that kind of reference to Abraham in different ways, precisely because one belongs to God's people. And the whole sort of tone of Luke and the book of Acts that follows is the expansion out of what that means to all who call upon the name of the Lord and are saved. Now, verse 17 shows us the crowd responding joyfully to what Jesus has done. Their joy, in the Greek word cherio, chimes in with the doxology, if you will, of the woman's praise when she is set free at last and able to stand tall once again. But the synagogue leader, and it's hinted at all those who oppose Jesus, were put to shame because of their opposition and hostility. And we're told finally that the crowds were rejoicing in the glorious things, as Luke's Gospel puts it, that Jesus was doing. So this is a really challenging text, and it really, I think, encourages us to think about when we build up our traditions and we have particular things that we do that are important to us, why do we do them? Why are they important? Are they about liberation and setting free and wholeness and the life of the kingdom of God? Or do they actually function to keep us down and oppress and restrict freedom in a way that runs contrary to the love of God?